It was a brilliant move, you have to admit. His voice was a low purr, dripping with a smug satisfaction that made my stomach clench. I stared at him, at the way he leaned back in his chair, his tie loosened, the picture of someone who'd just won the lottery. My $12 million pitch. Gone. Absorbed into his portfolio, repackaged as his own brainchild, and already on its way to securing funding he'd never have dreamed of finding on his own. The hum of the office air conditioning suddenly felt like a roaring furnace, suffocating me. My life, before this, had been a carefully constructed facade. I'd spent years building a quiet reputation, working behind the scenes, nurturing ideas like fragile seedlings. My brother, Marcus, had always been the loud one, the one who craved the spotlight, the one who'd inherited their father's booming laugh and equally booming ego. We were different. I was the quiet gardener, he was the showman who'd trample over the flower beds for a standing ovation. Our family dinners were a masterclass in passive aggression, his victories always celebrated with a bit too much champagne, my quiet achievements met with a perfunctory nod. He had this uncanny ability to absorb the air in any room, leaving everyone else to breathe in the leftovers. It was exhausting, this constant need to be, that he projected onto everyone around him. I remember one Christmas years ago, when I'd finally landed a small, but significant, contract. It was my first real breakthrough after countless rejections. I was bursting with quiet pride, wanting to share it with my parents, with Marcus. He'd been too busy to attend the initial family gathering, arriving hours late, already flushed with a new deal he'd supposedly closed. When I finally managed to corner him, to show him the signed document on my phone, his eyes glazed over for a split second before he clapped me on the shoulder, his smile wide and insincere. "That's great, sis. Really. But listen to." And he launched into a convoluted story about his own supposed triumph, overshadowing my news with a force that felt like a physical shove. It was his modus operandi, diminish, then absorb. Then there was the inheritance. Our father's passing had left a void, but also a substantial estate. Marcus, predictably, had swooped in, the self-appointed executor. He'd insisted on managing things, his pronouncements about fiscal responsibility delivered with a theatrical sigh. I'd found him one afternoon, not with tax forms, but with a ledger open on the dining room table, meticulously cataloging the antique watch collection, his fingers tracing the gold inlay with an avarice that was unsettling. He'd barely glanced up, mumbling about preserving family assets, while I'd watched him, a knot tightening in my chest, sensing the subtle shifts, the way he seemed to be claiming ownership not just of the assets, but of our father's legacy itself. It was the quiet entitlement that always gnawed at me, the assumption that everything of value was, by right, his. The pitch. It had been my magnum opus. Months of late nights, of meticulously researched projections, of weaving together complex financial models and market analyses into a narrative so compelling, so undeniably brilliant, that I believed it could change the landscape. It was more than just a business plan, it was a vision. I'd presented it to a select group of potential investors, a carefully curated list, and the feedback had been overwhelmingly positive. I was on the cusp of something huge, something that would finally validate all the years of quiet dedication. And then, Marcus. He'd somehow gotten wind of it, not through official channels, but through the insidious grapevine of our family acquaintances. He'd cornered me at a charity gala, his eyes glittering with that familiar, predatory glint. "Heard you've got something cooking, sis," he'd said, his arms slung casually around my shoulders. Something big. I'd been naive, or perhaps just too consumed by my own excitement to see the warning signs. I'd shared fragments, just enough to pique his interest, thinking he might offer some insightful advice, a brotherly sounding board. Foolish. The moment it happened was etched into my memory with agonizing clarity. We were in my small, but meticulously organized, home office. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the faint aroma of the jasmine tea I'd brewed. I had the final draft of my proposal spread across my desk, glowing on the monitor. Marcus sat opposite me, his posture relaxed, his fingers steepled. I'd invited him over, intending to discuss potential advisory roles, someone I trusted to help navigate the early stages. He'd listened intently as I'd walked him through the core concepts, the innovative strategies, the projected returns. My voice had been steady, my enthusiasm barely contained. Then, I'd shown him the executive summary, the culmination of everything. He'd leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the screen, a slow smile spreading across his face. Incredible, he'd breathed, the word hanging in the air like a promise. Truly incredible, Elara. I'd beamed, my heart swelling. Thank you, Marcus. I knew you'd appreciate the boldness of it. He'd chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. Boldness? My dear sister, this is genius. Pure, unadulterated genius. He'd paused, his eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I saw it. A flicker of something cold, something calculating, that had nothing to do with brotherly admiration. You know, he'd continued, his voice taking on a different timbre, I've been working on something remarkably similar. A real game changer. Coincidentally, it aligns almost perfectly with what you've presented here. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. My hands, which had been resting on the desk, suddenly felt clammy. Similar? I'd managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Marcus, this is the culmination of years of my work. He waved a dismissive hand. Ideas are fluid, Elara. Inspiration strikes in strange ways. What matters is execution. And I have the connections, the gravitas, to make this happen. Quickly. He'd stood up then, his movements fluid and assured, a stark contrast to my frozen immobility. Don't worry, sis. I'll make sure you're acknowledged. In due time. Perhaps a small consulting fee, once things are really moving. He'd picked up a stray page of my proposal, the one detailing the patent strategy, and tapped it with a manicured finger. This part, especially. Brilliant. He'd given me a wink, a chillingly familiar gesture that now felt like a brand. Don't fret. It's in good hands. And then he'd walked out, leaving me in the suffocating silence, the scent of jasmine suddenly cloying, the glowing screen mocking me with the ghost of my stolen future. The weight of his betrayal settled in my chest, heavy and suffocating, a physical ache. The next few days were a blur of frantic, fruitless calls. He'd gone dark, his phone disconnected, his office politely stating he was unavailable. I'd reached out to the investors, the ones I'd so carefully courted, only to be met with polite confusion. They'd heard a similar pitch, yes, from Marcus. He'd presented it, polished and confident, a few days after our meeting. He'd even used some of my exact phrasing, my unique market segmentation. He'd essentially stolen my intellectual property, repackaged it, and presented it as his own, using the foundation I'd painstakingly built. The audacity was breathtaking. The damage was done. He'd secured initial funding, a substantial sum, and was already making headlines in the financial press. My vision, my $12 million dream, was now his launchpad. I didn't rage. I didn't cry, not in front of anyone. The storm brewed inside me, a cold, dark expanse. I retreated, not into despair, but into an icy calm. I reread every email, every communication log, every drafted document. I meticulously pieced together his timeline, his access points, his insidious machinations. I found the digital fingerprints he'd so carelessly left behind, the casual way he'd borrowed my research data, the draft emails he'd sent to his contacts using my proprietary information. He'd been so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility, that he'd believed his connections and his smooth talk were enough to shield him from any repercussions. Then, I found it. Buried deep within the contract I'd signed with the original development firm I'd hired to help build the proprietary software for my pitch. A clause I'd barely skimmed, a standard boilerplate I'd assumed was non-consequential. It stipulated that any intellectual property developed under the contract remained exclusively mine, explicitly transferred in writing with my full consent. Marcus, in his haste to claim my pitch as his own, had presented the core software concept, the one I'd commissioned and paid for, as a foundational element of new venture. He hadn't sought my consent. He hadn't even bothered with a cursory nod. The next meeting was a carefully orchestrated affair. I requested it myself, specifying a neutral location, a conference room at a sterile business center, chosen for its lack of personal history or emotional resonance. Marcus arrived, late, of course, but with that same self-assured swagger. He was flanked by his new legal team, all sharp suits and sharper smiles, clearly expecting another display of my dejection. I sat at the head of the table, my laptop open, a single document displayed on the screen. My voice was low, steady, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Marcus," I began, the sound of my own voice foreign, measured, "we need to discuss the foundational software for your new venture." He smirked. "Already covered, Elara. My teams integrated it beautifully." I nodded, my gaze never leaving the screen. "Indeed. And yet, the development contract for that software, the one I commissioned and paid for, clearly states that all intellectual property remains exclusively with me." I tapped the screen, highlighting the specific clause. "You've proceeded with its integration and commercialization without my explicit written consent, as required by the agreement. That makes your current use of it unauthorized." A ripple went through his legal team. Marcus's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something akin to surprise, quickly masked by annoyance. "That's preposterous. It's a shared concept now. I've built upon it." "You have," I agreed, my tone still dangerously calm. "But the foundation, the core intellectual property, is mine. And the contract is ironclad." I scrolled down, revealing a second document. "This," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a chilling intimacy entering my tone, "is the cease and desist order. Along with the preliminary injunction application. My legal team filed it this morning. Your funding, your entire launch, it's on hold, pending resolution. And given the clarity of this contract, the resolution will be in my favor." The color drained from Marcus's face. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked from me to his lawyers, his eyes wide with disbelief. The smug satisfaction of days past was gone, replaced by the stark, cold realization that he had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, by the quiet sister he'd always underestimated. His legal team was already whispering furiously, their confident demeanor shattered. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The air in the room, previously charged with his assumed dominance, now felt heavy with his defeat. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Marcus's carefully constructed image crumbled overnight. The media, which had been fawning over his brilliant new venture, now reported on the legal injunction, the allegations of IP theft. His investors, once eager to throw money at him, grew hesitant, then outright hostile. Panic set in. He tried to spin it, to paint me as a vindictive sister, but the evidence was irrefutable, laid out in cold, hard legal text. He unleashed his usual flying monkeys, distant relatives, old business associates who owed him favors, to try and pressure me, to paint me as unreasonable. They called, they texted, their words laced with thinly veiled threats and accusations. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. I had the contract, the proof, and the quiet certainty of my actions. Marcus himself became a pariah. His calls went unanswered. His emails piled up, unread. The vibrant social media presence that had been his hallmark went silent. He disappeared from the public eye, a sudden, jarring absence. The grand pronouncements, the booming laughter, the effortless charisma, all of it had been a facade, built on a foundation of appropriation and entitlement. Without the stolen ideas, without the ill-gotten gains, the edifice simply collapsed. I never heard from him again, not directly. I saw his name in a brief, dismissive article months later, mentioning a bankruptcy filing. The $12 million pitch, the one he'd so casually snatched, had become his undoing, not his salvation. My justice wasn't swift or loud. It was quiet, precise, and absolute, leaving behind only the chilling silence of his fall.